Hi everybody! This video goes over the readings and assignments for week 6 of English 680. For this week, we again have two readings. The first is an article by Nancy Summers, and the second is another chapter from Cynthia Urbanski's book. As with past weeks, I have gone ahead and written a short introduction to the two readings. I'll go ahead and open that now. I do strongly encourage you to read this in detail, but there are a few parts of it that I want to emphasize. So the first thing I want to point out is that both of the readings for this week, in some sense, touch on the idea of revision. And writing studies scholars and composition scholars see revision as an important part of the writing process, and they also distinguish it from editing, which, as we'll learn, is not necessarily the case for all writers, especially student writers. So just to go over that in detail, they see revision as a process in which a writer re-sees the whole of a piece and makes changes that affect the whole of a piece. This might mean moving around paragraphs and doing these large-scale organizational revisions. It might mean, and it often means, if you write at a fairly high level, especially if you're doing scholarly writing, it often means getting rid and jettisoning entire paragraphs or even pages of what you've written, and maybe writing entire paragraphs or entire new pages of what you've written because you realize that you need to shift the focus, or stuff you've said doesn't really fit or isn't really relevant to the point you're trying to make, and that you need to add content to develop ideas or to further support ideas. It also might mean making other sorts of changes that affect the whole of the piece in some kind of way. As opposed to this kind of large-scale revision, editing, the process of editing is usually used to describe smaller scale revisions. So things that just affect one small piece of a piece of work. And this is often seen in terms of sort of sentence level changes. So editing would be, for example, changing out a word, or tightening a sentence, or fixing some grammatical mistakes. Things that affect a small piece of the work or the piece of writing as opposed to the whole. So just once again, to reiterate what I said, revision involves big sort of structural changes, and editing usually involves smaller localized changes. So both of these articles touch on the idea of revision as opposed to editing. And the first reading we have is an article by Nancy Summers, which is called The Revision Strategies of Student Writers and Experienced Adult Writers. And this is an article that's fairly old. It was published in 1980, but it's useful for really two reasons. The first reason is that it provides you another example of what scholarship looked like at the beginning of the process movement. So if you think back to that reading by Chris Anson, where he talked about the shift in scholarship towards trying to understand what writers actually did when they were writing, and as opposed to thinking about what good writing looks like, just trying to understand what it is that people even do when they sit down to write. This is an article that came out of those questions and sought to answer some of those questions. So it's an article where Nancy Summers, she basically took two groups of writers and asked them to revise some stuff and tracked that process. And then she draws conclusions about the difference between student writers and experienced writers, and then the process of experienced adult writers. And I won't give away all of her conclusions, but she does note some pretty striking differences in how these two groups of writers approach revision. And then the second reading is a chapter from another chapter, and this is actually the last chapter that we're reading out of Cynthia Urbanski's book. And this chapter talks about revision, but it also talks about other parts of revision, other parts of the writing process in general. So especially when you're reading this, some questions I want you to think about, as I say in this little intro that I give you. I first of all want you to think about how these practices that Cynthia Urbanski is talking about in this chapter reflect an emphasis on the entire writing process and not just the invention, which is what we talked about last week. And then secondly, as I say in this other question I have, the other article by Summers talks a lot about what experienced writers do when they revise, but it doesn't talk a lot about how how teachers can get students to practice effective revision. And part of that is just that's not just the focus of the article. The focus of the article wasn't on teachers, the focus of the article was on what revision looks like. That was the focus of our article. Sorry about that. But in Cynthia Urbanski's chapter, she actually gives some concrete strategies for how to teach effective revision. So I want you to keep an eye out for that and think about how those strategies might be useful for teachers. Okay, and then as far as actual activities that we're doing this week, you have another discussion 6, and once again we have some moderators who are developing those questions. So I will put that discussion up when I get those questions from the moderators, which will hopefully be on either Sunday evening or early on Monday morning. And then finally, you have a draft of your synthesis paper. So as with your literary narrative, you will be submitting a draft of your synthesis paper, and then I will be having you read and respond to each other's drafts in groups and writing groups of that draft, and then get feedback from each other, and then also some feedback from me before you submit your final draft. You can find information about that assignment and the instructions for that assignment in the major assignments area of Blackboard. And you can also find a video that goes over that assignment in more detail if you go back to the week 5 folder, where I posted a YouTube video that goes over that assignment in a little bit more detail. If you have questions about any of this, especially the synthesis paper, feel free to send me an email. Do remember, however, that you will be getting some feedback from your peers and from me on the draft of your synthesis paper before you revise it and submit it for your final grade. So, it doesn't necessarily need to be perfect, at least for this week when you turn that in. But do let me know if you have questions. And otherwise, I look forward to seeing what you guys have to say about the readings this week.